The Road to Maplewood. Chapter 1. The Departure. The house was quieter than usual that morning, as if it knew he was leaving. Thomas Callahan sat at the edge of his unmade bed, staring at the travel bag resting by the door. The bag wasn't full, just a few shirts, an old leather jacket, shaving kit, and a well-worn journal. But it seemed heavier than anything he'd ever carried out of a burning building. At 58, Thomas had known heavy. He'd hauled people out of fires, shouldered the grief of families when he couldn't save everyone, endured the silence of long nights when his wife Linda was already asleep and he was still wide awake with memories of smoke and screams clinging to him. But this bag, this trip, this decision, it was heavier because it meant stepping into something unknown. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, laying stripes of pale gold across the hardwood floor. Dust motes drifted in the air, shimmering like faint ghosts. Thomas rubbed his rough hands together, his knuckles scarred and his palms thick with the kind of wear that never quite fades. He let out a slow breath. Maplewood, he muttered to himself. The word felt strange on his tongue, like a secret spoken aloud for the first time in years. He hadn't been back there since he was a young man, barely 20, still full of restless energy and unshaped dreams. Maplewood was where his parents had lived, where he had walked the narrow roads with a fishing pole slung over his shoulder, where he had kissed Linda for the first time under the giant oak by the river. And yet, after he left for the academy, after he became a firefighter in Richmond, he'd rarely looked back. Life had a way of pushing forward, one call after another, one duty after another, until suddenly decades had passed. Now Linda was gone, 2 years already, though sometimes he still reached for her in the night. Their daughter Emily lived in Denver with her own family. The house, once filled with laughter, arguments, and the aroma of Sunday pot roast, was now only echo and dust. The road to Maplewood wasn't just miles of pavement. It was memory. It was confrontation. It was a step towards something he had avoided too long. Thomas rose, his knees stiff, his back reminding him of the years he had carried more than any one man should. He grabbed the bag and slung it over his shoulder, wincing slightly. As he walked through the narrow hallway, he glanced at the photographs still hanging there. Emily in her cap and gown, Linda holding a pumpkin pie, the three of them at the beach in Virginia. The frames seemed heavier than the walls themselves, their smiles both comforting and cruel reminders of time. In the kitchen, he brewed a final cup of coffee in the old machine Linda had insisted on keeping, though it rattled and groaned like it was about to give up. The smell filled the room, bittersweet and grounding. He sat at the table, tracing circles on the wood with his finger, remembering the countless mornings he had sat across from Linda, their conversation alternating between grocery lists and dreams they were too tired to chase. He took a sip and stared out the window. The maple tree in his yard was already shifting to red, a hint of autumn's arrival. Leaves trembled in the breeze, readying themselves for the fall. Thomas finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it back in the sink. He picked up his keys, his phone, and finally, with a last look around, stepped outside. The screen door creaked as it closed behind him. The truck waited in the driveway, old but dependable, a Ford F-150 that had seen more winters than he cared to count. He placed the bag in the passenger seat, slid in behind the wheel, and rested his hands on the steering wheel. For a long moment, he didn't turn the ignition. His reflection stared back from the rearview mirror, lined face, gray in his beard, eyes that had seen too much fire and too much loss. He wondered what Linda would say if she could see him now. Probably something like, "About time you stopped hiding in this house." She always had a way of cutting through his stubbornness. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to empty something deep inside him, Thomas started the engine, the truck grumbled to life, and with it, so did the road ahead. The first miles out of Richmond were familiar, Strip malls, traffic lights, the hum of morning commuters rushing toward offices and schools. He blended into the flow, but his mind was already far from the city. He drove with the windows cracked, letting the cool air rush in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint promise of autumn. As the city gave way to open stretches of highway, Thomas's grip on the wheel loosened. Fields spread out on either side, dotted with hay bales, farmhouses, and the occasional rusting tractor left to rest by the fence line. He passed by roadside diners, their neon signs flickering even in daylight, and gas stations that seemed frozen in time. Every mile carried him closer to Maplewood, but also deeper into himself. Memories surfaced uninvited. His father teaching him how to drive on a gravel road, his mother calling him in for dinner from the porch, the sound of crickets thick in the summer air. He remembered leaving all of that behind, desperate for something bigger, for a chance to prove himself in the city. And he had. He'd worn the uniform with pride, answered the calls, saved lives, but at what cost? The further he drove, the more he realized how long it had been since he'd taken a journey without a destination dictated by someone else. No fire to put out, no duty roster, no one depending on him to arrive in the nick of time. This was his road, his choice. That, in itself, felt foreign. Around midday, he pulled off at a small diner just off Route 33. The sign read, Maggie's Place, the kind of establishment that promised strong coffee and pie better than anything in the city. Inside, the air smelled of bacon grease and maple syrup. A jukebox in the corner hummed an old country tune, and a handful of regulars occupied booths, their conversations low and steady. Thomas slid onto a stool at the counter. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a ponytail streaked with silver, poured him coffee without asking. "On the road?" she asked. "Something like that," Thomas replied. "Where you headed?" "Maplewood." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, as though the name carried weight. Not many folks say that these days. Quiet little place. You got family there? Thomas hesitated. Had, he said softly, a long time ago. She gave him a sympathetic smile and refilled his cup. "Well, Maplewood's still quiet. Some things don't change. You be safe out there." He ordered a slice of apple pie and ate slowly, savoring the cinnamon and warmth. For a moment, he felt less like a man running from silence and more like a traveler moving toward something. When he returned to the truck, the sun had shifted west, painting the sky with hints of amber. He drove on, the hum of the tires steady against the road and the landscape slowly transforming into rolling hills and thicker woods. By late afternoon, he pulled off at a rest stop. He stretched his legs, feeling the ache in his knees. A family nearby was tossing a football, their laughter rising into the crisp air. He watched them for a moment, his chest tightening. Emily had been that little once, running through the yard while he and Linda clapped from the porch. Time had stolen those years too quickly. Back in the truck, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out the old journal he had packed. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. It had been Linda's idea years ago, to write down the moments that mattered. He had filled it sporadically, scribbling thoughts after long shifts or recording Emily's milestones. But the last entry was from the night Linda passed, his handwriting shaky, the ink smudged with grief. He turned to a blank page. The pen felt heavy in his hand. After a long pause, he wrote, August 14, 2023, on the road to Maplewood. Not sure what I'll find there. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything I've been avoiding. But I'm going. He closed the journal, slid it back into the glove box, and sat quietly for a moment. The hum of traffic faded, replaced by the sound of leaves rustling in the trees. When he finally started the engine again, he felt a little lighter. Dusk crept in as he neared the county line. The road narrowed, lined with towering oaks and maples whose leaves had already begun to blush red and gold. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Thomas slowed the truck, rolling down the window to let the cool air brush against his face. The sky above burned with the colors of a fading day. fiery orange melting into purple. It felt like the kind of evening he hadn't noticed in years, too busy, too distracted. As he drove, he whispered to himself, "Almost there." But Maplewood wasn't just a place on a map. It was a reckoning. It was the place where everything had begun, and maybe, if he allowed it, where something new could begin again. The road stretched ahead, winding through the trees, carrying him deeper into memory, deeper into change. And Thomas kept driving.
Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The further Thomas drove, the more the world around him began to resemble something half-remembered from a dream. Roads narrowed into two-lane stretches flanked by dense woods, their branches arching overhead like cathedral ceilings. The fading sunlight seeped through the leaves, dappling the pavement with shifting patterns of gold and green. Each mile pressed deeper into a silence that was not empty, but full of memories waiting to surface. The highway signs grew rarer, and so did the cars. He rolled the window down, inhaling the scent of pine and damp earth. The hum of cicadas filled the air, steady and unrelenting, reminding him of summers when he was a boy, running barefoot through the tall grass, with no thought of duty or sorrow. He hadn't thought much about those years in a long time. Life in Richmond, the firehouse, the relentless calls, it all demanded too much of him, left little room for nostalgia. But out here, on this road to Maplewood, his past came knocking, whether he invited it or not. It began with a smell. Somewhere along the bend of County Road 14, the air shifted, carrying with it the faint aroma of fresh-cut hay. It was a smell so particular, so vivid, that it snapped him instantly back to a memory of his father. He saw it clearly. A summer afternoon when he was 12, standing in the fields with the sun blazing high, watching his father stack bales with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. His father's shirt had been soaked through with sweat, his hat pulled low to keep the sun out of his eyes. Thomas had been too small to lift much, but his father had shown him how to balance one bale on another, how to work with rhythm instead of brute force. You don't fight the weight, you move with it, you respect it, and it respects you back. At the time, Thomas hadn't fully understood, but later, when he was hauling unconscious bodies through smoke-filled stairwells, those words returned to him. Move with the weight. Respect it. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. His father had passed away before Thomas graduated the academy, before he could see his son in uniform, before he could know how deeply those simple lessons had rooted themselves. For a moment, Thomas felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He blinked hard, focusing back on the road. Not long after, another memory surfaced, carried not by smell, but by sound. The faint, rhythmic creak of crickets and the rustle of cornfields brought him back to nights lying on the roof of the old barn with Linda. They had been teenagers then, barely 16, watching the stars with their hands entwined. She had laughed at his nervousness, the way he stumbled over words, the way he pretended not to be terrified of falling both off the barn and into love. "I'm not going anywhere," she'd whispered to me, her breath warm against my cheek. It had been the first night he kissed her, a kiss that tasted of hay and daring and forever. He remembered the thrum of his heart, the way the world had narrowed to just the two of them, under a sky vast with stars. Now, decades later, the echo of that laughter still rang in his ears. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. Linda had been gone for 2 years, but in moments like this, she felt closer than ever, woven into the fabric of Maplewood itself. The road dipped and curved, and Thomas slowed the truck, letting the tires crunch softly over gravel. He passed landmarks he had nearly forgotten: an old gas station with a rusting sign, a bridge that spanned a narrow creek where he used to fish for trout with his childhood friend Danny. Danny. The name rose up like a ghost. They had been inseparable once, two boys tumbling through fields, daring each other into trouble. Danny had been braver, wilder, always the one to climb higher, run faster, push further. Thomas had admired him, envied him even. But Danny hadn't left Maplewood. He had stayed, worked the mill, married young. Their lives had diverged, their letters had slowed, and eventually the calls stopped altogether. Thomas didn't even know if Danny was still alive, if he'd stayed in the same old house, if he'd remember him at all. The thought lingered. What would it be like to face someone who represented the path you never took? By the time the sky darkened fully, Thomas pulled off the road again, this time at a small clearing just off the highway. He killed the engine and stepped outside, stretching his stiff legs. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and the air smelled of damp leaves. Above him, the stars emerged one by one, crisp and bright in the country sky. Richmond's lights had always dimmed them, but here they burned fierce and clear. He leaned against the truck, his hands tucked into his jacket, and for the first time in years, he let the memories come freely. He thought of his mother calling him in for supper, her voice carrying across the yard. He thought of Sunday mornings at church, where he had fidgeted in the wooden pew, impatient for the hymns to end so he could race out into the sunlight. He thought of the town fair, the Ferris wheel creaking as he and Linda had ridden it again and again, her laughter spilling into the night. Each memory arrived like a wave, gentle at first, then crashing hard. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was mourning for a life he had once held and had somehow let slip through his fingers. But woven through the sorrow was something else, a quiet gratitude. He had known love. He had known belonging. He had known the warmth of Maplewood, even if he had abandoned it for too long. Back in the truck, Thomas reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the journal again. He flipped to the page he had written earlier and added beneath it, "The road is full of ghosts. Not all of them haunt me. Some guide me. Some remind me I was alive once and not just surviving." He closed the journal, resting it on the seat beside him. As the truck rumbled back to life, Thomas realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: anticipation. Maplewood wasn't just a destination. It was a mirror waiting to show him who he had been and maybe who he could be again. The echoes of the past were not there to hold him captive. They were leading him home. He drove on into the night, the headlights cutting through darkness, the road unspooling before him like a story he had once started but never finished.
Chapter 3: Crossroads. The highway narrowed into a long, winding stretch that seemed to coil endlessly through the Virginia countryside. Thomas kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting on the gearshift, his eyes fixed on the faint white lines gleaming beneath his headlights. The night pressed close around him, thick and hushed, broken only by the rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt. He'd driven for hours since leaving that quiet clearing. The echoes of the past still lingered, stirring in the corners of his mind, but now something heavier settled in his chest, a question he had been trying to avoid. What if Maplewood isn't what I remember? Places change, people move on, time erases as much as it preserves. Maybe the old fishing hole was filled in, the oak tree by the river cut down, the house where he grew up demolished. Maybe Danny was gone. Maybe no one even remembered the Callahan name anymore. And if that was true, then what was he really driving toward? Nothing more than an empty stage where the past once played. The thought sat like a stone in his gut. He rolled down the window, letting the night air wash over him. Crickets sang in the fields, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. The sound brought a measure of calm, but it didn't silence the doubt. A pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, distant at first, then growing closer. Thomas shifted slightly, keeping steady in his lane. The vehicle behind him was moving fast, too fast for these dark country roads. As it closed the distance, Thomas tensed. The lights flared bright, high beams slicing into his mirror. He squinted, jaw tightening. "Easy, kid," he muttered under his breath, though he couldn't see who was driving. The car, a beat-up sedan, swerved once, corrected, then roared past him, its engine rattling as it disappeared around a curve. Thomas exhaled slowly. Damn fool's gonna kill himself. But not 5 minutes later, as he rounded the same bend, he saw it. The sedan pulled onto the shoulder, hood open, smoke curling into the night sky. A figure stood beside it, pacing with the phone pressed to their ear. Thomas slowed the truck and pulled in behind the stranded car. Old habits died hard. Even retired, even weary, a part of him still answered distress calls without thinking. The figure turned as his headlights dimmed. It was a young man, maybe mid-20s, wearing a worn hoodie and jeans. His expression shifted from frustration to cautious relief. "You all right?" Thomas called as he stepped out of the truck. "Not really," the young man said, lowering his phone. "She just died on me. Battery, maybe, or alternator. I don't know. I was trying to get back to Charlottesville." Thomas walked over, peered under the hood. Years of firefighting had taught him to handle all kinds of emergencies, mechanical or otherwise. He spotted the corroded cables, the faint whiff of burnt oil. "You're not going anywhere tonight," Thomas said, straightening. The young man sighed, running his hand through his hair. "Figures, as if this day wasn't bad enough." Thomas studied him for a moment. He was wiry, restless, with dark circles under his eyes, the look of someone carrying more weight than his shoulders were built for. "Name's Thomas," he said. "Truck's over there. I can give you a lift to the next town." The young man hesitated. "Why would you stop? Nobody stops anymore." Thomas gave a half shrug. "Old habits." For a moment their eyes met, and then the young man nodded. "I'm Alex." The cab of the truck was quiet at first, save for the rumble of the engine. Alex stared out the window, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. Thomas didn't press him. He'd learned long ago that silence often said more than words. Eventually, Alex spoke. "You from around here?" "Used to be. Heading back to Maplewood." Alex gave a short laugh. "Maplewood. My mom grew up there. Haven't been in years, though. She says it's the kind of place time forgot." "Something like that," Thomas murmured. They drove a few more miles before Alex leaned his head back against the seat, exhaling hard. "I was trying to make it to my girlfriend's place. We had a fight. I stormed out, and now here I am, stranded on the side of the road like an idiot." Thomas glanced at him. "Happens." "Fights, I mean. You'll figure it out." "I don't know. Maybe not. She says I don't know what I want." Maybe she's right. For a brief moment, Thomas saw himself, not at 25, but at 58, sitting alone in his kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, wondering if he'd lost everything that ever mattered. "Truth is," Thomas said quietly, "none of us really know what we want. Not at your age, not even at mine. But running never solved much.
Alex turned to look at him, studying the lines in his face, the gravel in his voice. There was a flicker of recognition there, as if he sensed the weight Thomas carried but didn't ask. They reached a small crossroads, a literal one, where two roads diverged beneath the faint glow of a flickering street lamp. One sign pointed east, towards Charlottesville, the other pointed west, towards Maplewood. Thomas slowed, the truck idling at the intersection. "Well," he asked. "Charlottesville's about 30 miles that way, Maplewood's 20 the other." Alex hesitated. "Guess I should head back. Try to fix things." But his voice lacked conviction, as though he were half hoping Thomas would decide for him. And in that pause, Thomas felt the question turn inward. Should I even keep going to Maplewood, or is this road nothing but ghosts? The silence stretched, broken only by the tick of the blinker and the distant cry of a nightbird. In his chest, a battle raged. One road promised safety, a retreat back into the familiar emptiness of Richmond, the solitude of his house, the avoidance of old wounds. The other road promised confrontation, memories, maybe even pain. It was a choice, not unlike the ones he had faced in burning buildings: go forward into danger, or turn back and let the fire consume what it would. Finally, Thomas spoke, more to himself than to Alex. "Sometimes you don't get many more chances to go back." He flicked the blinker west, towards Maplewood. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Then I guess I'm coming with you. At least part of the way." Thomas nodded. The decision was made, but its weight lingered. They drove on, deeper into the night. The road narrowed further, lined with trees whose branches clawed at the sky. The headlights cut a narrow path, but beyond that, darkness pressed close. After a while, Alex dozed off against the window, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. At the wheel, Thomas felt a strange clarity settle in. That crossroads had been more than asphalt and signposts. It had been a reckoning. He had chosen not to turn back. For the first time in years, he had said yes to something instead of no. The doubt still lingered, but so did a new feeling: resolve. Maybe Maplewood had changed. Maybe it hadn't, but he would face it. He glanced at Alex, sleeping soundly despite the rough road, a boy running from his own battles. Thomas wondered if fate had put him there for a reason, to remind him that even the young were haunted, that even the restless carried wounds. And maybe, just maybe, the road wasn't only about finding the past. Maybe it was about learning how to guide someone else toward the future. By the time they saw the faint glow of Maplewood's outskirts on the horizon, the night was deep and star-strewn. The town waited, quiet, cloaked in memory and time. Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel, heart heavy and light all at once. The road had brought him here. Now the past would have its say.
Chapter 4: The Town of Maplewood. The first glimpse of Maplewood came not with grand fanfare, but with a modest wooden sign half hidden by branches. "Welcome to Maplewood, founded 1896, where roots run deep." The paint was faded, chipped by decades of weather, but the words struck Thomas like a bell tolling in his chest. He slowed the truck, headlights washing briefly over the sign, and then pressed forward. The town appeared gradually, like an old photograph emerging in a dark room. The outlines of houses, porches with creaking swings, lampposts casting pools of amber light onto cracked sidewalks. Maple trees lined the main road, their leaves already turned a deep crimson, as if the town itself was steeped in autumn.
Beside him, Alex stirred awake. He rubbed his eyes, blinking at the view. "So this is Maplewood," he murmured. Thomas didn't answer right away. His throat was tight, his gaze locked on every familiar detail. The general store, with its old sign still squeaking in the breeze. The narrow diner on Main Street, where he and Linda had shared countless milkshakes after school. Even the barber shop was still there, its poles spinning lazily as if time had never touched it. And yet, it was different too. Storefronts that once had been lively were now boarded up. The old movie theater was dark, marquee letters missing or broken. The sidewalks were quiet, only a few figures moving through the evening haze. Maplewood was still Maplewood, but smaller somehow, wearier, like a person grown old without realizing how quickly the years had gone. Thomas parked near the square. The fountain at its center trickled faintly, though the stone was chipped. A few pumpkins were set on the courthouse steps, early decorations for the fall festival that must still happen every year. Alex stretched. "Guess this is where I leave you. I'll see if there's a bus in the morning." Thomas gave him a firm nod. "Take care of yourself, kid." "Yeah," Alex said, shouldering his backpack. "You too." For a moment, he watched him disappear down the quiet street, the silhouette swallowed by shadows. He wondered if their paths would cross again. Maybe fate would decide. But his own fate was waiting. He walked slowly through the square, his boots crunching against scattered leaves. Each step carried weight. He half expected to see his younger self racing past, fishing pole in hand, or Linda leaning against the fountain, hair catching the sunlight. Ghosts lived here, etched into every corner. And then, as he turned the corner toward the edge of town, he saw it. A small hardware shop, its windows cluttered with tools, garden supplies, and the faint glow of a lamp inside. Above the door hung a familiar sign, Mercer's Hardware. Thomas stopped cold. His heart thudded. Danny Mercer. The last time he had seen Danny was more than 30 years ago. They had hugged goodbye awkwardly in this very town, one headed toward the fire academy, the other staying behind to take over the family business. Letters followed at first, then phone calls, then silence. And now, here was the store, still standing, still alive. Without fully realizing it, Thomas pushed the door open. The bell above rang with the same tinny chime he remembered from childhood. The smell hit him instantly, wood shavings, motor oil, the faint tang of metal. From behind the counter, a man looked up. At first, Thomas didn't recognize him. The hair was thinner, grayer, the frame was stockier, slowed by age, but then the eyes, clear, sharp blue, the same as they were when boys were stealing apples from Mrs. Collins' orchard, locked on him. "Tommy," he said, voice rough with disbelief. Thomas' breath caught. "Danny." For a moment, the years vanished. They were 12 again, racing down the dirt road barefoot, shouting each other's names. But then, the silence stretched, and all the years crashed back in. Danny came out from behind the counter. His hands were calloused, his gait stiff, but his face broke into a grin that lit the room. He grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, shaking him once before pulling him into a fierce embrace. "Lord Almighty," Danny muttered. "I thought I'd never see you back here again." Thomas laughed, though his voice cracked. "Didn't think I'd come back myself." When they finally pulled apart, Danny studied him with the kind of scrutiny only an old friend could manage. "You look older. But hell, so do I. Come on, sit. You're not just walking in here and leaving again." They sat at a small table tucked near the back of the shop. Danny poured them each a glass of bourbon from a bottle he kept in a cabinet. "For long days," he said. The amber liquid glowed in the lamplight. Thomas took a sip, the warmth settling deep in his chest. 30 years, Danny said, shaking his head, his glass. It nearly did. Danny leaned back, studying him. You became a firefighter, right? I heard that much. Folks here used to say you were out there saving the world. Thomas gave a short nod. Tried to. He hesitated, then added quietly, Lost a lot, too. Danny's eyes softened. Linda. The name caught Thomas like a blade to the chest. He swallowed hard. 2 years ago. Silence fell heavy. Danny reached across the table, placing a hand on his arm. I'm sorry, brother. She was a good one. The best. Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The ache in his chest was sharp, but there was comfort too, hearing Linda's name spoken aloud in this place that had once held their beginnings. The conversation drifted then, carried by memory. They spoke of the river where they had caught frogs and dared each other to jump from the rocks. They laughed about the time they tried to fix Danny's father's old tractor and nearly blew up the shed. They recalled nights sneaking out to watch the stars, making promises about futures they barely understood. But beneath the laughter was a current of tension, unspoken, but felt. Finally, Danny broke it. You know, Tommy, when you left, I was mad at you, mad as hell. Felt like you were running from this town, from me, from everything we had. But I get it now. Some men need the world to be bigger. Some of us, we just stay put. Thomas set his glass down. I wasn't running from you, Danny. I just needed to prove something. To myself, maybe. To my father, too. I thought Maplewood was too small to hold me. Danny gave a half smile. And was it? Thomas exhaled. No. Turns out no place is big enough to outrun yourself. The words hung there. Danny nodded slowly, as if he understood more than Thomas said. Later, after the shop had closed and the bottle of bourbon had thinned, they stepped outside. The night air was cool, stars scattered bright above them. Maplewood lay quiet, but not lifeless. Porch lights glowed, dogs barked faintly in the distance. It was the same town, and yet different. Older, scarred, but still breathing. Danny clapped him on the shoulder. You staying long? Thomas hesitated. Don't know yet. Well, Danny said, you've got a place here if you want it. I mean that. Whatever road brought you back, maybe it was the right one. Thomas looked at his friend. The boy who had once been his shadow, now a man shaped by years of steadiness, while he himself had been shaped by fire and loss. For the first time since Linda's passing, Thomas felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't dared to name, belonging. That night, as he lay in the small guest room Danny had offered him above the shop, Thomas listened to the creak of the old building settling around him. Through the window, the maple leaves rustled softly, carrying with them the echoes of a life once lived. He realized then that coming back wasn't just about facing ghosts. It was about finding the pieces of himself that he had left scattered here in Maplewood, waiting all these years. And tomorrow, there would be more ghosts to face. But tonight, he wasn't alone.
Chapter 5. Unspoken Truths. Morning sunlight poured through the window of the guest room above Mercer's Hardware, spilling across the quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. Thomas stirred, groggy from a night of uneasy dreams. He had slept, yes, but Maplewood had crept into his sleep in ways he couldn't control. Faces from his youth, the heat of fire, the echo of Linda's laughter. He sat up slowly, joints stiff, and for a long moment simply listened. Below, the shop creaked with activity. He could hear Danny moving about, the dull thud of boxes set down, the metallic ring of tools. Life continuing, steady as ever.
Thomas pulled on his boots and went downstairs. Danny looked up from the counter and grinned. "Morning, sleepyhead. Coffee's in the pot." Thomas poured himself a cup, inhaling the bitter steam. He felt almost normal, standing in this old shop with its rows of nails and paint cans, its smell of wood and oil. Almost. "Town's already buzzing," Danny said. "Fall festival's coming up. Folks are setting up stalls, hanging banners. If you walk through Main Street, you'll see half the town out there." Thomas nodded absently. A festival. He remembered those. Caramel apples, hay rides, the contest for the biggest pumpkin. He hadn't thought of such things in years. "Thinking of heading down there?" Danny asked. Shrugged. "Maybe. Don't know how people will take seeing me again." Danny chuckled. "You'll be fine. Trust me. They remember you." It was said lightly, but the words lodged in Thomas's chest. Remember him? How? As the boy who left? Or as the man whose name sometimes flickered through news reports after fires that had made the evening broadcasts? He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and decided to find out. The streets of Maplewood were alive in a way he hadn't expected. Stalls lined Main Street, selling jars of honey, handmade quilts, carved wooden toys. Children darted between booths, faces painted with pumpkins and cats. Music drifted from a small stage where a local band strummed fiddles and guitars. As he walked, heads began to turn. People paused mid-conversation, eyes narrowing in recognition. A woman gasped softly, pressing her hand to her chest. A man at the bakery stand whispered something to his wife, who then turned, her gaze fixed on Thomas as though he were a ghost. It was disconcerting. Then someone called out, "Tommy Hart?" Thomas turned. An older man, tall and thin, hurried toward him. It took a second before Thomas recognized him. Mr. Kellerman, his old high school history teacher. "Good Lord, it is you!" Kellerman exclaimed, grasping Thomas's hand in both of his. "Back from the ashes, eh?" Thomas blinked. Yes, I'm back for a visit." Kellerman's eyes shone. "You don't know how proud this town's been of you. Every time the news mentioned your name, we said, 'That's our Tommy, our Maplewood boy, out there saving lives. Hero of the city,' they called you." A small crowd had begun to gather, faces old and new, pressing closer, murmuring. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Hero. The word landed heavy. He had heard it before, thrown at him by reporters, printed in headlines. But here, in Maplewood, it carried a different weight. These were people who had known him as a boy, who remembered the scrawny kid with dirt on his knees and dreams bigger than the town itself. He tried to smile, but the expression felt strained. He said, "I was just doing my job." Softly. "Just your job?" a woman asked. Mrs. Collins. Her orchard had been their playground once. Her voice trembled. "You pulled people from burning buildings. You risked your life. We used to clip the articles, pin them to the board at the library." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone clapped him on the back. Another shook his hand. Children peeked out from behind their parents, eyes wide at the thought of a real-life firefighter hero in their midst. Thomas's heart pounded. The warmth of their admiration was suffocating. They didn't know the whole story. They couldn't. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a voice cut through. "Hero, huh?" The tone was sharp, edged with bitterness. The group parted slightly, revealing a man standing apart, arms crossed. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, his jaw set. His eyes bored into Thomas with something colder than recognition. Thomas's breath caught. He knew that face. Mark Callahan. Memories rushed back, the night of the warehouse fire, the screaming alarms, the chaos. And afterward, silence. Reports filed, lives counted, one name missing. Mark's brother. Thomas's stomach clenched. Mark stepped closer, his voice steady but hard. "You all talk about him like he's some saint, but heroes don't come home when others don't." The crowd fell silent. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, sensing the tension. Thomas swallowed. "Mark." "You remember my brother, don't you?" Mark asked, his eyes like a blade. "Jason. He was just 24. You were his captain that night." The weight of the memory pressed down on Thomas's chest. He remembered every detail, the roar of the flames, the collapsing beam, the split-second decision to pull two men out while Jason was still inside. By the time they went back, it was too late. "I remember," Thomas said quietly. His voice trembled. "I remember every day." Mark's jaw tightened. "Then you remember that you chose who lived and who didn't." A hush swept through the crowd. Eyes flicked between them, uneasy. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "I made the call I thought would save the most lives, but I've carried Jason with me ever since. There isn't a night I don't see his face." For a long moment, Mark just stared at him. Then he spat on the ground and turned away. Some hero. He walked off, the crowd parting silently to let him through. The silence he left behind was deafening. Thomas's legs felt weak. He muttered something, an excuse maybe, and pushed his way out of the crowd, heart hammering. He walked blindly through the streets until he found himself at the edge of town, near the river. The water flowed steady, indifferent. Thomas sank on a bench, burying his face in his hands. The word echoed in his mind. Hero. Failure. Both. Neither. He had lived his life between those two truths, never able to reconcile them. Footsteps approached softly. A shadow fell across him. "You okay?" He looked up. Danny stood there, concern etched across his face. Thomas exhaled shakily. "They think I'm something I'm not." Danny sat beside him. "You think you're the only man who carries ghosts? You made the call that night. Doesn't matter if folks call you a hero or a coward, you're still the one who has to live with it. And you have." Thomas's voice cracked. "Mark's right. Jason died on my watch." "And you think hating yourself brings him back?" Danny asked sharply. "Listen, Tommy, you can't keep punishing yourself forever. You did what you thought was right. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but life doesn't give us perfect choices." The river whispered around them. Thomas stared at the current, remembering Jason's face, the last words he'd heard him shout. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," he said. Danny put a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe that's what coming back here is about. Not them forgiving you, not even Mark. You. You've got to decide if you can live with the man you are." The words sank deep, heavy but true. For the first time, Thomas realized that Maplewood hadn't just been calling him back to remember the boy he was. It had been calling him back to face the man he had become. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window of the guest room, watching the lights of Maplewood flicker out one by one until the town was dark. In the silence, he whispered Jason's name, not in guilt this time, but in remembrance, a prayer. And slowly he felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of it. A crack in the weight that had pressed on his chest for years. The truth had been spoken, the silence was broken, and maybe, just maybe, the road to Maplewood still had more to give. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. The morning of the Maplewood Fall Festival dawned crisp and golden. Thomas woke to the smell of wood smoke drifting through the window and the sound of distant laughter echoing through the streets. For the first time since he'd arrived, he felt something stirring within him that wasn't grief or guilt. It was anticipation. He dressed slowly, pulling on a clean shirt Danny had insisted he borrow, and paused to glance at himself in the mirror. The face that stared back was weathered, lined, and older than he remembered, but the eyes seemed different. Not lighter, not free of pain, but clearer, as though some of the fog had lifted. Downstairs, Danny was already bustling around, preparing small toolkits for kids to win as prizes. "There you are," he said, grinning. "About time. The whole town's out there already." Thomas chuckled. "Guess I'm not as quick as I used to be." Danny clapped him on the back. "None of us are. Come on, let's go be part of it." Main Street had been transformed overnight. Strings of lights stretched between buildings, glowing against the bright blue sky. Booths overflowed with pies, caramel apples, and jars of jam. Children darted past in handmade costumes, scarecrows, foxes, pumpkins. The scent of roasted corn and cinnamon hung heavy in the air. Music drifted from the small stage where a fiddler and guitarist played a lively tune, couples twirled, boots stomping on the wooden boards, while others clapped along. The town square, which had seemed tired and faded when Thomas first arrived, now pulsed with life. He walked through it all with Danny at his side, feeling both out of place and deeply connected. At once, people greeted him warmly. Some offered quick words. "Welcome home, Tommy. Good to see you back." A few clasped his hands, eyes filled with something deeper, respect, sorrow, gratitude. The confrontation with Mark Callahan still weighed on him, but the edges of it felt different now, less like a wound, more like a scar, still there but no longer bleeding. Near the fountain, Thomas stopped. Children crowded around it, tossing pennies into the water, making wishes. He remembered doing the same a lifetime ago. He closed his eyes briefly, the sounds of laughter swirling around him, and let the memory wash over him. When he opened them again, he saw a face in the crowd. Mark Callahan. The man stood apart, arms crossed, watching. His expression was unreadable. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Mark gave a brief nod, nothing more, just the barest inclination of his head before turning and disappearing into the throng. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, and for Thomas, it was enough. The day unfolded in a blur of warmth. He watched Danny's grandchildren race in sack races, their laughter ringing out. He sampled a slice of pumpkin pie from Mrs. Collins, who insisted he take an extra piece for the road. He joined a small circle of old classmates who reminisced about high school football games and nights spent at the drive-in. At one point, he found himself standing near the stage, drawn by the music. The fiddler's bow danced, the guitarist strummed, and a young woman's voice rose in a clear, strong song about love and loss and the turning of seasons. The lyrics hit Thomas deep, but instead of breaking him, they held him together. He thought of Linda, her laughter echoing in his mind. For the first time, the memory didn't feel like a blade. It felt like a bomb. She was gone, but she was still here, woven into the fabric of who he was. He closed his eyes and let the music carry him, not away, but deeper into himself. As the sun set, the town square glowed with lanterns strung overhead. The air grew cool, the stars pricking the sky. Families gathered close, sharing blankets and hot cider. The final event of the night was about to begin, the lantern release. Danny nudged him. "You stand for this? Tradition, you know?" Thomas nodded. "Yeah, I'll stay." The townspeople gathered, each handed a small paper lantern. Thomas accepted one, feeling the delicate weight in his hands. It reminded him of the lantern festival that he had once seen in the city long ago, but here it felt different, smaller, more intimate, as though the whole town's heart beat in unison. The mayor gave a short speech, thanking everyone, speaking of roots and family and the seasons of life. And then one by one, flames were lit. Lanterns bloomed with golden light, glowing softly in the darkness. Thomas fumbled with his own at first, but Danny helped steady his hands. Together, they coaxed the flame to life, and the lantern swelled with warmth. He held it, staring at the glow, and then with a deep breath, he let it go. The lantern rose slowly, swaying in the cool night air before catching the current and drifting upward. He watched it climb higher, joining dozens of others, until the sky was filled with floating stars. His chest ached, not with sorrow, but with something new, hope. "Linda," he whispered, "this one's for you." And for the first time, he felt like she heard him. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Thomas and Danny lingered by the fountain. The last of the lanterns still glowed faintly overhead. Danny nudged him. "You know, when you first came back, I thought maybe you'd just pass through, like Maplewood was just another stop on your road." Thomas smiled faintly. "I thought so too." "But," Danny prompted. Thomas looked around, the town square bathed in lantern light, children laughing, couples holding hands, neighbors saying goodnight. He thought of the weight he had carried, the truths he had faced, the scar that still throbbed but no longer defined him. "But maybe the road led me exactly where I needed to be," he said quietly. Danny grinned. "Then I'd say Maplewood's glad to have you back." Thomas chuckled. "I don't know if I'll stay forever, but for now, yeah, I think I'll stay." They stood in comfortable silence, two old friends side by side, as the lanterns drifted farther into the night. The next morning, Thomas awoke before dawn. Something pulled him outside, into the cool air still heavy with dew. He walked through the quiet streets, past shuttered booths and empty tables, until he reached the edge of town where the fields stretched wide. The horizon was painted with the first light of day, soft pinks, deep oranges, and gold spilling upward. The maple trees glowed like fire in the rising sun. Thomas stood there, breathing it in, feeling the earth solid beneath his boots, the sky opening above. He thought of the boy who had once left Maplewood, desperate for more. He thought of the man who had faced fire, loss, and guilt, and he thought of the man standing here now, scarred, older, but not broken. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The road had brought him back, not to who he once was, but to who he was meant to become. As the sun crested the horizon, Thomas smiled. It was a new day, a new beginning, and he was ready.